Welcome back. Thanks for joining me again. When I was a kid, there was a nursery rhyme that said, "What are little girls made of? Sugar and spice and everything nice. That's what little girls are made of." Well, in this lesson, we're going to talk about what are clouds made of. And to start our discussion, we're going to talk about something that you're probably already familiar with, and that's software as a service. You might not know you're using a software as a service, but you're probably doing it in your everyday life. So let's think about what a common software as a service might be. Software as a service is where the entire infrastructure, operating system, and software are provided by a third party. A pretty common software as a service is email. Google provides email software as a service using Gmail. Yahoo has Yahoo Mail, and there are many other types of software as a service email providers as well. Another type of software as a service you might be familiar with is Dropbox. Dropbox provides storage as a service that allows you to save your files from your computer off to Dropbox storage. So there are many different types of software as a service. You might even use something like Office 365. Microsoft provides web-based Microsoft Office services using the Microsoft Office 365 interface. That is a software as a service as well. So as you can see, software as a service is pretty common and something that most of us use on a daily basis without even knowing it. So now that we have an understanding of software as a service, let's think about infrastructure as a service. Infrastructure as a service is the underlying hardware that's required in order for us to even run our applications. So Google can't provide us with email if there's no server hardware and a network and storage that are on the back end of that to allow them to provide that software as a service. So the underlying infrastructure, meaning our compute, network, and storage, are those components that we need in order to be able to provide any type of cloud services. So infrastructure as a service is where part or all of your infrastructure is provided by a third party. So we have that basic or core set of components that are required in order for us to use an infrastructure. They are compute, network, and storage. So let's look at a hardware infrastructure stack. And a stack is basically just a set of components that are grouped together to form an infrastructure. So in this stack, we have our network, and we talked a little bit about networks in the previous lesson. And then you have storage. And storage is, again, just somewhere where you can keep all of the data. And then we have our compute. And our compute being our overall brains of the operation, right? It gives us that ability to do processing. So when we put data onto our compute, the compute is able to process that data to complete a task based on that data. So when you do infrastructure as a service, you're in essence leasing or renting that infrastructure stack, right? So you're paying a third party to provide you with that hardware. Now, why would you do that, right? So we're going to talk more about why you would do that as we go into the next slide. Now, infrastructure as a service quite often utilizes something called a hypervisor. A hypervisor allows us to create virtual hardware. So all of the components that are required to make up our compute, storage, and network are made logical using software. The hypervisor is installed onto our compute, and then on top of that hypervisor, we're able to utilize virtual machines. And these virtual machines make up our platform as a service. Now, you don't necessarily have to do it based on virtual machines. You could do it by installing directly onto the compute, but there's a distinct advantage to utilizing virtual machines. One is the ability to migrate them. So if there was a problem with this underlying hardware, we're able to move those virtual machines to a different piece of hardware. So they're not permanently tied to that compute. And by providing you with access to either the physical compute or to the virtual machines, you're able to install your own operating system and install your own applications and use the platform for your own purposes. So that's platform as a service. And then, of course, on top of our platform is where our apps are running. So that is where our software as a service comes into play. So when people provide cloud computing services, they're basically providing one of these three types of services: infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service. Now, what type of clouds are there? We have private cloud, hybrid cloud, and public cloud. A private cloud is where you control everything. So you have your own data center, and inside of this data center is your compute network and storage. Now, the advantage of you owning your own data center is that you can customize this however you want. You can use what hardware you want. You can manipulate that hardware whenever you're ready. You can upgrade the hardware when you're ready. You can add more compute. You can add more storage. You can do whatever you like with that environment. Cost of doing so, however, is really high. It's expensive to build and maintain data centers. And the life cycle for that equipment is typically no more than 3 to 5 years. So you might spend hundreds of thousands of dollars or potentially millions of dollars purchasing this equipment. And in 3 to 5 years, that equipment has to be replaced. So you can imagine the high capital cost to only get 3 to 5 years out of that equipment. And then there's the number of employees that they have to pay to support that equipment, and the power and the cooling and everything that goes along with it. And then there's what we call a lack of elasticity. So we're going to talk about elasticity more in another slide, but it means that the environment doesn't have great flexibility. You can add more equipment to support your users and applications, but once you've purchased that equipment, it's yours. If you don't utilize it all, that's kind of too bad for you. You've already paid for that equipment. Now, many organizations are doing what they call hybrid cloud. This is where you utilize a cloud provider for some of your services. So let's think about something like backup and disaster recovery. So this allows us to say, hey, we don't have to have that capital investment to support our disaster recovery environment. And if a tornado or hurricane comes through and wipes out our data center, we can then fail over to the cloud. Then you have the ability to use those cloud services for other things as well, right? So if you had remote workers, you might have those remote workers connect to cloud services so that you keep your corporate environment protected. But all in all, in a hybrid environment, you're going to have some type of connectivity between your corporate data center and the cloud. But a hybrid cloud allows for great flexibility when you have remote workers that need access to certain services, but you also want to keep your corporate environment intact and separate. Sometimes you also see this used for migration. So you might start with a small piece of your environment set up in a public cloud, and then over time, you migrate over to public cloud. And then public cloud gives you a lot of flexibility because you don't have any upfront cost, but you get to utilize that infrastructure. It's pay as you go. So if for some reason you decided you didn't want to use the cloud anymore, you don't have to pay for it, right? You might have to come up with a migration plan to get your data out, but you don't have to continue to pay for cloud if you don't want to. The overhead is low because all of that underlying hardware, the cooling, all of the power, everything that's required to support that data center is handled by the cloud services provider. So you don't have to worry about those costs. It's also infinitely scalable and elastic. And we're going to talk about those terms in another lesson, but be aware that how the environment can grow and shrink can be done dynamically when you're utilizing public cloud. That's not something you can do when you have a private cloud. Now, there are some challenges. You don't have the same overall flexibility that you have with private cloud. You also have to worry about things like governance challenges. If you have compliance regulations that you have to follow, then public cloud can pose some challenges. You have to be very careful about what type of cloud provider you utilize, you have to utilize one that will support those requirements. But you do get overall faster provisioning and simplified deployments because, again, you don't have to worry about that infrastructure. So what type of a cloud is AWS? It is infrastructure as a service, meaning that all of this underlying hardware is provided by AWS, and AWS provides you with access so that you can set up your platform. You can set up your virtual machines to install your operating system and your applications. AWS also provides some of their services in what looks more like software as a service. So as an example, AWS provides storage using something called Simple Storage Service, or S3. S3 is a bulk storage service where you can upload virtually any type of file. Think about how you have an external hard drive, maybe on your computer, or you might have Dropbox as a service. S3 gives you that ability to save your data up into the cloud. AWS provides infrastructure as a service, but they also provide additional services that provide applications as a front end to those infrastructure services to simplify your ability to utilize AWS. They basically want their interface to be presented to you in a way that makes it easy for you to use. But they provide all of those infrastructure services necessary to support the overall environment, the compute, the storage, the networking. They also provide the ability for you to use their virtualization services, databases. They have hundreds of tools that you can utilize to build and support your environment. Everything from setting up your own platform with virtual machines to support your applications, to providing developer tools that help application developers make applications that can run on the AWS infrastructure. So that's going to do it for this lesson on what a cloud's made of. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson.